Chapter 17. Hurriedly leaving Chip and Marion together in the pines to compose their differences, if that was possible, Pat cut down towards the anvil and shortly ran into Sam's saloon. "Where's Hardwick?" he barked. This time Sam wasn't so vague. "Over yonder." He gestured in a direction opposite to that he had pointed out for the girl, and he made no mention of Marion. "What's going on, Pat?" Pat had already started away. "Come on, you'll hear," he tossed back. They found Sheriff Hardwick 10 minutes later, several of the possemen with him, his glance racked over Stephen's importune face. "Well?" "We're on the wrong track, Hardwick," Pat opened up curtly. "I suspected as much. Chad Hanlon's your man, and this time there's no question about it. Grab him alive, and he'll explain all the hell on the range." Hardwick and the others listened as he repeated Marion's tense story of her encounter with Epstack and the appearance of Hanlon on the HM. The lawman's last doubt dissolved on hearing on the attack of Henry McLennan. "Where's Hanlon now?" he rasped. "Marion thinks he cut over the hills for Ashurst. Throw up a net in the San Simon Valley, and we can box him in." "Yeah." Dan was gruff. "Let's get going." All the grim purpose of this manhunt was now forced on Hanlon, as Pat intended. Before they set out, however, he drew Ezra aside for a muttered word or two. "Epstack is legging it for Guerlo Peak," he told the lanky one. "He's red hot, and ringy as a wolf. Go get him." Nodding, Ezra swung on his horse and trotted away without a backward look. He would have made no bones about hurrying his pace could he have guessed what had happened, and was going on even now, in the direction in which he was heading. Chip Connor had been wrong about Epstack when he declared the man to be miles away and increasing the distance with every passing minute. That Ep had suffered a terrible scare, that could be no question. But he was by no means as badly rattled as his brutal, if abortive, attack on Marion McLennan had proclaimed. A yellow streak, never very far from the surface, had forced Stack to develop the craft of a coyote, coupled with the viciousness of a wolverine. And it was so now. Convinced that Marion had witnessed his ruthless murder of Ike Mosher, the sanctuary of the Mexican border loomed large and enticing in Ep's thoughts. But he had no intentions of leaving this scarlet blot on his back trail like a finger pointing towards a hunted and unrested future, if it could be possibly avoided. Swinging off into the pines, when Marion gained the safety of her uncle's ranch, he didn't go far.
"I'm not done with that dame,"
he muttered to himself darkly.
"She can't stay there forever, and once her mouth is stopped, I'll drift with a good chance of being forgotten altogether."
He had no idea who might be found at the HM. At this hour it was usual for most, if not all the men to be absent about their work. But the possibility of running into another witness, Ep would have run the girl down regardless. Not yet was he so far lost to caution, however. Someone might be around, should the girl find no one at home to listen to her story. Moreover, it could only serve to drive her back to the open range the sooner. When she emerged in search of someone to help her, perhaps carry her tale to the law, Epstack meant to pounce, and this time more effectively. It was for this reason that he crept behind a rocky ledge 100 yards from the ranch house, concealing his horse in a nearby clump of alders. The spot did not afford a particularly good view of the ranch, but he cared none the less. Ep watched the yard for 10 minutes, without detecting any sign of movement whatsoever. He was starting to raise his head for another look when his horse started thrashing about. Cursing under his breath, he turned back. He's probably alarmed by a rattler, common in this country. The horse failed to quiet down. Stack was afraid he might vent some betraying scream or whistle. Climbing down there, he found no trace of Snake, but the pony was thoroughly entangled in the scrub brush, the dropped reins doing nothing to simplify the matters. Busily straightening things out, Stack suddenly froze. The slashing clip-clop of running horse drifted to his ears, racing this way. Expecting the girl at any moment, Ep kicked excitedly at the snarled antlers in a fever, lest Marion should make good her escape after all. The clattering horse rapidly drew near. Yanking his own mount into the open roughly, Stack swarmed astride the leather, and with a kick sent the animal dancing past the end of the rocky ledge directly in the path of the oncoming horse. It hauled in with a sliding scrape, and Ep leaned forward fiercely, his clawing hands sneaking towards his gun. In his utter amazement, it was not Marion McLennan who faced him now, but Chad Hanlon. And for a tense moment the two stared, facing at each other, wordless. Hanlon's face was a thundercloud, his hard eyes searching his confederate in a sullen heat. But Ep missed this, crowding forward eagerly.
"What are you doing here, Chad?"
He whipped out.
"I thought you'd be busy serving a deposition notice."
"The question is," Hanlon jarred through Ep's talk, "what have you been up to, Stack?" His flinty tone was ominous. "If what I've just been hearing is true—"
"Forget it,"
Ep interrupted excitedly. He cared nothing that the others should know his guilt, seeking to press on Chad the advantage of this depravity.
"You're in the clear of that ranch now. I smashed Stevens and ain't saying how, but I fixed him good this time."
"And you fixed the rest of us along with him, you blundering fool!" Hanlon roared. "If it's about Mosher, you needn't explain it. I just come away from hearing that McLennan girl tell her uncle that you downed Ike. Of all the damn blameless tricks you... Why didn't you write Hardwick a letter beforehand telling him what you aimed to do?" Stack whitened as the words confirmed his worst fears. For the first time he came to a full stop. On catching sight of Hanlon, it had occurred to his wily mind in a flash that here was one of whom, once told of his recent activities with some judicious editing, he might depend on to finance his flight. That hope was blasted now.
"You mean McLennan knows that I done it?"
he stammered out.
"Well, how could he help knowing? Get out of my way, you useless fumbling knothead."
He jammed his horse forward into Stack, slashing at him wildly with his quirt, and would have ridden over the other had not Ep hastily hauled his mount aside.
"Hold on, Chad," he was whining. "You can't throw me down this way. Everything I done was in your interest. Where you heading?"
"I'm getting out of the country as a result of your damn butter-fingered work," Hanlon shouted. "I'm wise to you now. I ought to blast you before I pull out, and I believe I will."
"Chad, wait! Hang it all, what are you talking about?"
Ep cried out in a terrified voice. His face had gone white as paper, and every muscle in his body was tense. "I'm telling you," Chad snarled. "Who was it that let himself get caught tearing down Anvil Fence? It was you, wasn't it? It was on your account that Stevens always knows so damn much about me. You blew the game, you weak-witted fool, and now I'm going to blow you away." Once more, face almost black, he threw himself at Stack. Ep fended off that murderous attack somehow, managed to knock Hanlon's raising gun out of his grasp before he could get to its deadly work. He understood now that this man had gone berserk with fury. The instinct of self-preservation upmost, Stack yanked his horse around and kneed into a flashing run. As he disappeared from sight beyond the alders, Chad's impulse was to follow and vent on this man all the violence of his rage. But swift second thought prevailed, and Hanlon dismounted and retrieved his falling gun, then leapt back into the saddle and turned away, casting a look behind him at the H.M. ranch house as he went. Stack was not long in discovering that either Hanlon scorned pursuit or feared to losing the time. It was probably the latter. Ep's nerves tightened up as he realized his own crime could no longer be hidden. His time on this range was running short. All his distorted resentment that this should be so was directed against the girl. It was Marion who had brought his deep-laden plans to naught. She it was who first discovered and then betrayed him. And Well aware of Chad's weakness of this girl, Ep had not dared broach his devious and deep-running enmity to the other. Now, however, it flared into the open, hideous and corroding. Stack would have given much to meet her now under his own terms. But caution warned him that whenever Chad Hanlon hesitated to waste a minute, it did not behoove him to linger, fierce as the thirst of revenge might be. He started off across the range like a hunted thing, keeping to the cover of the scattered pines, and then suddenly, as he glanced down through an open swale he was warily heading through, to his amazement, he spied the girl making for the anvil. She was alone, face going thin and wolfish. Stack took up the trail, working as close as he dared there in the open, keeping an eye cocked for others who might be abroad. He watched from afar the girl's brief exchange with Sam Salone and saw her head resolutely turning towards the pine slopes. And once she passed in amongst the trees, he could have overtaken her swift without detection. As he hoped, she held straight on. Scarcely had she entered the woods before Ep started to close in. He meant now to be quick and final. So close was he, guiding his horse through the pines, when Marion met Stevens and Chip Connors, that the sudden outbreak of voices just ahead shocked him like an unexpected tap on the shoulder. Arresting his mount mid-stride, he listened intently. He could distinguish an occasional word, but no more. He recognized Pat's resolute tones with sinking heart, and only bitter purpose held him there in the abiding fear of a false move. Suddenly, Ep heard thumping hoofs, and through the pine boughs caught a fleeting glimpse of Stephen's departure. That emboldened him. Stealthily, he peered down through the pine trunks to see Marion and Connor starting down the deer trail together. Paralleling their course amidst thick pine scrub, Ep soundlessly kept pace while he considered this new development. It did not altogether discern him, feeling as he did that he owed Connor a grudge anyway, and that here was one man he was confident he could dominate. At worst, a single slug would eliminate Chip speedily enough, and in any event, Stack didn't propose now to be robbed of this chance of the girl. A break in the pines appeared ahead, but Ep paid no small heed. He was primed and ready, and shoved his horse forward. He jogged around the edge of the trees, soundless on the thick mat of needles, and confronted the unsuspected pair with cool arrogance, a glint of pure malice in his beady pupils. It was Marion who hauled up sharply with a startled "Oh!" of discovery. Connor had been confiding his glance to her face for some minutes now, and now he whirled sharply, darting his horse forward. "You, huh?" he ripped out swiftly. "What are you after, Stack?" Ep's Colt was already out. It leveled on Connor's chest, with an evil smile twisting the face above it. "Right now," he drawled, "I suggest you unbuckle your belt and just let your gun slide on down." Chip's alert senses warned him of what this encounter might end in. He might have thrown himself sideways, trusting to luck and a lightning draw, but the fact that Pat Stevens had snapped his handcuffs on Connor's handgun, that fatal encumbrance dangling on his side, reminded him that any such move as he contemplated would prove disastrous. "Do as he says, Chip," Marion spoke steadily. "He's capable of anything." "That's right," Stack leered at her, venting his bitter spite at everything she stood for and he did not. "And what more, I'm about to prove it." Slowly Connor lifted his free hand and unfastened his cartridge belt. His gun thudded to the ground. "Now, get off your horses, both of you," Ep ground out with savage pleasure. Chip's face went white and pale. His cinched straps creaked, and he paused, a stubborn look stealing into his eyes. "What are you aiming to do?" he demanded harshly. Stack jabbed at him with a menacing gun barrel.
I said get down.
He was breathing audibly now.
Want me to bash your head in? Just try and knock me out, you darn rat.
Connor blazed. In a sudden fury, real or pretended, he hurled defiance at the other man. Face darkening, Ep started his horse forward with a rush. In 3 feet from Connor, he jerked to a halt, realizing a possible trick, but it was already caught up with him, if a trick it was. Raising his hand, from the wrist of which dangled the loose cuffs, in a flash, Chip made a sweeping pass at Stack's contorted face. He wasn't close enough to hit, but the flying shackle at the end of its chain caught Ep a smashing blow alongside the head. He went out of the saddle backwards to bring up on his shoulder blades with a heavy thump, and his 6-gun bounced away. Instantly, Connor started to slide to the ground, seeking to get at him, and Stack was on his knees in a twinkling, plunging after his gun. His horse, standing between them, blocked Chip effectively. Giving over the useless plan abruptly, Connor whirled and slapped Marion's pony. "Get going!" he yelled at her. "He'll have that gun in a second." Side by side they raced down the deer trail, its many twists and turns shielding them from Stack's wrath for the moment. That this brief safety from a man with a gun could not long endure, disarmed as they were, Chip realized a few minutes later, catching the swift clatter of pursuit. Stack had regained his horse and was spurring it after them cruelly. There was no hope of losing him by swinging off. The trail here ran between converging dikes of rotten and crumbling rock, fully 100 feet high. Connor hesitated only a moment longer, every second expecting the crash of a shot fired from behind them. "Marion!" he shouted. "Slip off your horse! On the right side and roll into the brush. I'll do the same. It sounds crazy, but it's a chance." She looked at him, a look of plunky assent. "Say when." "Don't stop your horse. Now!" he whipped out, as they raced past a ragged wall of low-hanging shrubbery. Almost at the identical instant, both slid off their flying horses, rolled several times violently, and brought up at the edge of the brush. It was the work of a brief instant to crawl deeper into concealing brush, and barely had they made it when Ep Stack rushed by, the heels of his horses hammering. The pounding of the pony dwindled down the trail. "Won't he be back?" the girl asked anxiously, raising to look at her companion. Connor was covered with dirt smudges, as was she, but he was ready for anything. She appeared to depend on him entirely in this critical situation, a fact which Chip conspicuously omitted to notice. "He sure will." He was grim. "We've got maybe 5-10 minutes on the most." "What can we do, Chip?" He glanced up the jumbled crags overhead thoroughly, his manner preoccupied. "Climb, I reckon." Marion was aghast. "Can that crumbling wall be climbed?" "Well, you better ask yourself when you're on the top." He grinned at her tightly. Finding a tortuous crevice, they toiled upward in haste, loose rock crumbling under their every step and rattled downward. Chip would allow of no resting. "Stack's going to hear this noise and just come a-boiling. We got to make ourselves mighty hard to find," he panted. Almost before they knew it, they were on the crest. Halting, they looked about. There was no place to go, and little enough chance of hiding, and from a flat crown a few yards away, this knife edge sheared off almost precipitously on the other side. Chip would not chance climbing down. "We best rest." He stretched out on a rock. Weary arms over his head, and Marion sank down beside him. Pinyon shrub growing in the crevices sheltered them somewhat. "There was little enough need of your going through this," the girl murmured amidst an uncomfortable silence. "It's me that Stack is after." "He ain't getting you," grunted Connor briefly. She would not leave it at that. "Chip, why?" she insisted softly. You could have gotten away at any time. Was it because you didn't want to leave me? Connor stared at her wordless and looked away. Oh, there's no use getting into all that. Are you quite sure, Chip? If he failed to fathom her warm insistence, it was because the events of that last hour had opened her eyes to a lot of things. I could tell you it's because Stevens placed me in your custody and I gave him my promise, he returned doggedly. But that wasn't the real reason, was it? Marion, have we got to discuss this? He was hoarse. You're asking me to say things that I ain't got no right to say to you. Surely you're not referring to that silly charge against you. Don't you understand, Chip? I know who murdered Ike, and Hep Stack knows that I know. He glanced at her quickly, then shook his head stubbornly. It ain't that. It's the rotten things that I said to you before. The gall that I showed. Is that bothering you? Marion paused. I thought it over, and I believe you said nothing unjustified, Chip. She was almost demure. I must admit I was provoked at the time, but isn't that a woman's privilege? A child could not have misinterpreted the change in her manner. Forced to acknowledge it, Chip turned a dusky red. I thought I was talking for your good, he blurted out. And I believe you, she said gently. Doesn't that go a little way towards settling our differences, Chip? It went far indeed. Moved and incredulous, Connor scrambled to a sitting position facing her. Marion, he cried. She sat there, meeting his look and making no attempt to move away. Not even Chip, apprehensive as he could have mistaken that meeting. He was reaching towards her, roughly, arms outstretched, when a sound crashing arrested them. It was a small sound, only the light crash and jingling of falling debris on the rocky slope below, and both read its significance, their face going blank and tight. Stack. Marion's lips formed the name soundless, and Connor nodded. He sprang up, his understanding complete. Immersed in their private concerns, they had forgotten to guard their voices. Ep, searching the craggy wall below, had overheard them. They could say goodbye to any hope of eluding him, for even now he was climbing the weathered slope, bent on wreaking vengeance upon Marion, and he was armed with a gun. Leaping to the brink, Connor peered over, and through the brush he glimpsed Stack, warily laboring upward. He saw Chip and fired. The slug ricocheted, screaming into space, and Connor sprang back, but an instant later he was kicking madly at the crumbling rock on the edge, showering an avalanche of fragments down on the man below. Stack hung on, cursing, even when a tottering crag, crumbling into shale, slanted downwards to sail over his head. He forged upward a yard, and another, and like a cougar he prowled the ledges. Here! The rolling call came swelling up from the trail below, and peering over, Connor could scarcely credit his sight as he spied Ezra leveling a rifle over the pines. Its heavy shot crashed out. Don't shoot! It was Stack, staring down at the lanky man, and he was livid with fear. Don't you pick me off here like a fly, I'll come down, he yelled. Well, come on down then, and fast, Ezra roared. No telling how soon I'll lose my patience with you. Might even get a cramp in my trigger finger. Palsied with dread, Stack started to scramble down headlong. Ezra waited for him grimly. Soft arms stole around Chip Connor from behind as he stood there on the rocky crest, realizing their deliverance. Chip, came the caressing murmur over his shoulder. You've managed to save me in your rough and tumble fashion. What will you do now? There was an element of cajolery in her gentle tone. You're still in custody, my dear. Do you remember? I remember. His words were a murmur, and Marion felt the tremor running through his stalwart frame. Reckon I'll ride into town with you and wait until Stevens and those stem-widened buzzsaws of his finish their job, as Pat said they would," he went on, suddenly humble. "As for being in your custody, Marion, I hope I never forget it." He was husky. "You can be sure now that I'll not try to be escaping." End of chapter 17.